welcome back to the third and last session this day. I hope you enjoyed lunch and each other. The next session we have called Standing Up for Liberal Democracy. Russia's aggressive war against Ukraine has ended an era. How do we defend our liberal democracy in a multipolar world where states with different forms of government are competing for power and influence? This is a common challenge to all liberal democracies, and in this session we will look closer upon different actors and responses from the democratic globe. The speakers of the panel is first Hanna Shelest from Ukraine, directly from Odessa. Give her a big applause. Hanna is the director of security programs at the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism and editor-in-chief in UA, Ukraine Analytica. She's also a non-resident fellow at Center for European Policy Analysis. The next speaker in this panel comes from Germany, Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff. Thomas is the Guido Goldman Distinguished Scholar for Geostrategy at German Marshall Fund in Berlin's office. He's a long-time expert on transatlantic foreign and security policy. Currently, he's involved in a project on designing Ukraine's recovery in the spirit of the Marshall Plan. Give him a hand. Then from Denmark, we have Sten Rynning. He's a professor at the Center for War Studies at the University of Southern Denmark and a senior fellow of the Danish Institute for Advanced Studies. Last time we invited him was in September or October, last autumn, where he participated in our Army Summit. Give Sten a good... Together with Sten last autumn in Oslo, we also invited Charlie Salonius-Pasternak from Finland. He's also with us today. He's the lead researcher heading up the Center on US Power and Politics at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. He's also a senior research fellow at the Institute's Global Security Program. Welcome, Charlie. The last speaker of this panel is Ben Schreer, also from Germany. Ben is the executive director at the IISS Europe office in Berlin, where he heads the IISS European Security and Defense Program. He has previously worked many years as a researcher and professor on Indo-Pacific strategy in Australia, and that's why he is here. He's going to tell us about our new global partners in the Indo-Pacific. Big hand. And the moderator of this panel is Cecilie Hellestveit, doctor. You know her from the television screens in Norway and from, she's an eager debater in the Norwegian political landscape. Cecilie is a lawyer at the Norwegian Academy of International Law. Hellestveit is also a member of the Council of Ethics for the Government Pension Fund Global and has recently published a book on the war in Ukraine. But please let me welcome Hanna up to the podium. It's a long way.
Europe is so small, but then you realize how long it is when you need to take not the airplane, but the buses.
Please.
Hello, everybody. You know, this morning I've been thinking about from what to start. And I had several beginnings of my speech because I never write any speeches for the presentations. That's something impossible to make me doing. And originally I was going to start from 2015 because that was the year when I've been the last time at this conference. That year we were not at the university but at that lake house. I remember my session. I was with a Russian speaker and Julian was in the first row as usually. And what was interesting at that time, I was emotionally speaking, it was, if I'm not mistaken, yeah, it was just before the Minsk. So it was few days before the Minsk II was signed. And I've been discussing that that is the existential war, that Ukrainians are fighting not because of NATO or because Russia would like their military bases in Crimea, that it is much more serious. And I remember that at that time, most of the guests were so suspicious, like, you're so emotional, or you're probably from those Ukrainian nationalists, me, Russian speaker from the south. And at that time, the Russian colleague, who now evacuated to Denmark, but for this year of the war never contacted me, even that we've known each other for many years, asking even how am I. But he'd been saying that we need to understand Russia. And most of the room really hurt him with this understanding Russia. At that time, it was like, okay, what to understand? Do you try to understand rapist, why he's doing this? No. But it seems to me that we are still, unfortunately, even after the year of war, in the condition when some people are trying to make Ukrainians to understand the killer or the rapist psychology. I always thought that we need to understand to better punish, not to find some kind of accommodations with what and why it is done. But I hope that as we passed a lot of the stereotypes and false assumptions about this war, about Russia, within this year, and even overcome the German fear about tanks. So I really hope that probably yet a little bit, and we will reach that stage that we need. Then I thought to start from the present and from the naming, because here we are in the good situation, the session called Ukraine at War. Because what I really hate within these months is when somebody is saying Ukraine war or Ukrainian war. It's not Ukrainian war. We didn't start it, we didn't want it, we didn't provoke it. It is either Russian aggression or Russian-Ukrainian war, if you would like to be precise, or let's be honest, it is already our war. Because you can say as much as you want that it is just because it is at the Ukrainian territory only, as you assume, that it is only our problem and you're just helping and you don't want any escalation with providing Ukraine with the additional weapons. But the question is that any kind of the conflict is the perception of two sides, at least. Yep. And Russia perceives any member of the NATO, any member of the Rammstein group as the side to the conflict. They act against all our states as side to the conflict. So you can, as the 5-year-old, hide in the house and say, I don't see you, so you don't see me, yeah? But it doesn't work. And what we know almost daily from the news, from the intelligence, it is all those activities that we already witness, cyber attacks, buying politicians, or doing the subversive operations at the territories of the member states, violating the airspace or the territorial waters. All of these are symbols that Russia considers you as the side to the war. So the question is, are you prepared to be part of this, or you're still trying to excuse yourself of not being really prepared? That's why when we speak about Ukraine at war, I definitely can speak about a lot of the domestic issues, about how it is to live in the city of 1 million people with only 2 hours of electricity per day. Trust me, still with a better internet than in many European capitals. But that is another question. Yep, that is more of the domestic issues, how we overcome. That is more about the resilience of the population or of the society or of the governmental systems that we can speak about. But when we speak about the war, it's not only us who is in war. Because when you think about the energy prices, you are already, because you are in this war as well. So it seems to me that these words really matter. It's not because we are trying to impose, as Ukrainians, something to our partners, but because that is the reality. And the sooner we understand this reality, the easier it will be to us, as the societies of the Europe, of the West, as Russia tried to emphasize, to be prepared. But still, I don't like to name it the Russian West War, because let's look who is in the Rammstein group. You have Japan, who is dramatically changing their politics. So So it is already not the same situation. You have Morocco who are providing tanks for Ukraine. You are thinking about other countries who are really rethinking their strategic approaches. And we will have more and more. We had a perfect speech about China. I really enjoyed the previous session because it was finally said not about the attempts of China to be neutral. China involved in this war, just in a little bit different matter. Because if you think of being involved in the war only with the boots on the ground, it is really, let's say, abstract understanding of the war, of the modern war, and the modern warfare in this case. Still, what is interesting for me here is that it is understanding where we are now. And when you speak about Russia-Ukraine war, for me, the situation is changing daily. What is not changing is the tactics that Russia chose. You're speaking about escalation. We're afraid of escalation. I heard it from so many politicians. What does it mean escalation for you? Nobody can answer me. I asked this question in the Ministry of Defense of France. I asked this question at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Germany. I asked it my colleagues in the US. What does it mean escalation? What else should be done, in addition to what Russia is doing now against Ukraine, to consider it as escalation? Demolishing of the cities. We're in the wonderful university. Yesterday, Kharkiv University was bombed. It is one of the best Ukrainian universities, one of the oldest. What else? There is no, the Kyiv University, several of their departments completely ruined buildings already. No colleges for maritime specialization in Mykolaiv and Kherson. Should I speak about Mariupol University, Donetsk University? Should I name many of other universities around the country? They don't exist anymore. Do you know how many students came to my classes this semester and how many of them been at the front line? What else? Yep. So you're demolishing the lives, you're demolishing the energy system, you're demolishing the cities. Look at the pictures from Bakhmut, a wonderful old town on the east of Ukraine, one of the Cossacks' old Ukrainian towns. It doesn't exist. Read today morning article of David Patrikarakos in Unheard. It is just from the front line. He's been there a week ago. It just doesn't exist anymore. What else should be? Nuclear weapons? Okay, but let's think logically, not emotionally, about nuclear weapons. First of all, why we were not afraid of the nuclear weapons the same way during the Soviet Union times? Why the only question from the French MOD that I've been receiving during the 2 hours meeting was about nuclear? How possible it is, what are the scenarios, and so on. And I was shocked because I said, like, come on, but you also have nuclear weapons. You had them for years. So you had your plans, contingency plans, deterrence plans. You can understand the risk. You're monitoring the conditions of the Russian nuclear weapons. You already had it. Why suddenly in 2022 you became more afraid of the nuclear weapons that you've been, let's say, 10 years ago, or let's say in the 1970s or 80s? Why suddenly now? It is more about your fears than Russian capabilities in this sphere, first of all. And the second, we need to understand that the moment Russia is using nuclear weapons, it means that they lost the conventional war. It is the last resort. Yes, it is Putin Viagra. He needs to show up with the nuclear because many other countries don't have nuclear, that's why they are more afraid of it. But at the same time, those countries that have nuclear weapons, for you, it should be clearly understandable that the use of nuclear weapons means that Russia is going va-bank. They don't have anything else. That's the only thing that they can go. That's why, that's really quite a question for us. And what is interesting at the same time, and here the third part, because I was thinking also to start from the future. And where is the future of what and where we are? We started from democracy. Why we forgot that democracy should be defended, and that defended not only with the words. That's good when we are living in the ideal place where we can defend democracy only during the elections or during the parliamentary debates. But what to do, and are you ready to defend democracy and human rights with the weapons? My friend who received Nobel Peace Prize this year, Alexandra, one of the best Ukrainian human rights defenders, at each meeting during this year, she was asking for weapons. When you could imagine human rights defender asking for the weapons? I'm ready today to speak about Leopards and F-16, not as the escalation, but because the more Ukraine receives weapons, the quicker or the better we can defend democracy, defend the statehood, and defend the people. We are not fighting for the territories. We are the biggest country in Europe by territory. We are defending people. Look at those people at the first videos of Sky News, and it seems to me CNN was the second, who appeared in Kherson. Just the moment it was liberated. Look at the eyes and words of people who spent 7 or 8 months under the Russian occupation, what they've been talking about. Look at the resistance movement in Crimea, in Donetsk. You look at the yellow ribbon, what they are doing there, non-violent resistance. These people are waiting because they would like to live not in the totalitarian type of the state Russia is, but because they would like to live maybe not in perfect democracy, but in Ukrainian state, which is a democracy. And because of this, we're thinking about NATO in the same way, because sometimes we're coming with these strange stereotypes. You know, for how many years I heard about Finlandization. I even don't know how you use this term here, but especially Russians like this term. Ukraine should be Finlandized, or to have the Finland, it's not even in English, you can make the proper construction, but Finlandization of Ukraine, meaning this type of the neutrality. I'm now joking that I'm ready for Finlandization 2.0. Going to NATO, understanding what are the real threats and going to NATO. And here it was really strange for me to hear about membership action plan because of 2 things. First, membership action plan never been the compulsory condition for entering NATO. When membership action plan was introduced, it was the assistance to the country that would like to join, because it was the lessons from the first enlargement. It was reforms that countries voluntarily took and planned that they would like to implement to be better prepared for the membership. That's all. Only after Prague Summit, they started to include it in the declarations, saying something that can be some kind of prerequisite. But in original documents, read original documents about MAP, nothing about compulsory condition. So for this helping and assisting, Ukraine has annual national program. It is, if you compare the documents, they are almost identical by their structures and functions and everything. Also, Finland and Sweden, why nobody talked about membership action plan at least as the formal step? So it is not a formal step. It is the political decision. And membership action plan was a good excuse since 2008, again, because of the Russian influence, especially against Germans, to have it for Ukraine. So sometimes, you know, we would like to be, how to say it better, to be lied. I'm not sure, Julian, can we say it in English, but like we prefer to lie to ourselves because it was comfortable in this, because we found some excuses for this, when de facto we can return to the basics and to be as bold as the Russian president with what we want and how we are ready for this. That's why the NATO membership for Ukraine is extremely important. It is both the choice where we are, it is also the recognition that Ukraine currently is contributing to European security. And what are the preconditions for the NATO membership? There are only 3 in the Washington Treaty. Being a democracy, I hope nobody is doubting that Ukraine is a democracy. Being in Europe, again, I hope no questions about this. And contribute to European security. And that's easy to say that because of the war, Ukraine is not contributing. But that is your choice. And for many years we heard, no, because you are bordering Russia. Finland is also bordering Russia. It didn't stop you. And you saw how changed Russian rhetoric after this, yeah? So originally, if you follow Putin and Medvedev's statements in March, April, and May, they're fantastic. First statement, as soon as Finland would join, we will bring more weapons, like that will be the end of everything. Finland said, okay, and signed agreement with the United Kingdom to be like secured and a little bit more before the actual entering. immediately, oh, no. Membership of Finland and Sweden is not a problem for us. The problem is in case there are additional weapons coming. So the question is how bold you are. And what Ukraine is calling you to be the same bold as we are here. That's why I will finish probably with the last, because I see the time is running. Weapons. Sorry, I will speak about this. As you said, Ukraine at war. You didn't wrote me Ukraine with democracy. Yep. Ukraine receives a lot of weapons that we need, and we understand all the issues, domestic and international, for giving Ukraine weapons. But ask questions for yourself. Would you like to give Ukraine weapons so Ukrainians would not die and disappear as a nation, or that Ukraine wins? Why you are afraid that much of Ukraine winning? You are afraid of Russia losing? Why? Because the more weapons Ukraine receives for these 9 months, already almost 12 months, Ukraine proved that we are using them not to kill Russian people, civilians, but just to liberate our territories and to defend our people. So when we are asking for tanks, it's not to make a parade in Moscow. It's not good, it's small, there is no sense of doing it. But to have them on the battlefield around Bakhmut, so we would not have our soldiers died there in that amount. When we are asking for patriots, it's not because it is a sexy word, but because patriots can protect Kyiv University, Kharkiv University, or civilian infrastructure in Odessa. So think about weapons when Ukraine is asking for something is not because we would like some new toys, but because it is the lives of the very particular people on the ground. And the question is, would you like it to finish at Ukrainian territory and to have it Ukraine war? Or you would like very soon to have the problems at your borders? And here is just, my last note over here. Prime Minister said in the beginning that it should be still dialogue with Russia about maritime, fishery. We've been there. We started with this. Read Azov Treaty. Look what Russia did 2 weeks before, how they closed the maritime domain. That is exactly where, if you negotiate with Russia and allow them what they would like to do, you would have the first level of problems. Exactly in the maritime domain, exactly in the border domains. That is their favorite topics. The question is, are you learning Ukrainian lessons?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hanna, for your powerful and thought-provoking intervention. And then I will ask Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff to come to the stage and talk about the German Zeitenwende. The floor is yours.
Thank you. All right. So I was asked to talk about Zeitenwende after this, kind of a hard thing to do, because one of the words that Hanna used was bold. And so one question would be, how bold is this thing, Zeitenwende? People will ask, is it working? Some people will ask, does it even exist? Is it a PR thing? So I'll try to give you an answer, and I think it'd be a mixed answer in the report card, because it's about a year ago this month that the Chancellor gave his now famous Zeitenwende speech. And it also depends on your expectations, what you actually expect this to be, and how you understand Zeitenwende. And many people by now understand it in many different ways. First of all, let's go to the term Zeitenwende. It's one of these great German composite terms like Gesamtkonzept or Weltschmerz, usually composite of something, either a feeling or an intellectual concept that brings something into one word. In fact, I would call it rather a misnomer, because it's not the turn of the times, as the English translation would say, but it's rather a German about face. The times had changed much earlier. It was just a conception of the Germans that only it took the war to understand for us that something has changed. And I would posit to you that some people had understood long ago in the German context that something was changing, and that it was changing at the latest in 2014. So the term Zeitenwende is first of all one that tries to legitimate something. From a German position. Why did I say it depends, how that report card goes depends on how you look at it? Because of course people would like this to be all kinds of things. Most of our neighbors want it to be that we finally become like them, that we see the world finally like they do, and they grade us to the degree that we've now come across, and are we now French enough? Are we now Polish enough? Are we now British enough? And that's the report cards they give us, and on that count you can never suffice on that basis. So let's go back to the speech and let's review what it actually said and what the Chancellor of the Federal Republic actually wanted to see the country change, what change he wanted to see. It was about three things. It was about energy dependence on Russia. It was about defense within NATO. And it's about Russia relations. It's about these three things. And let's review for just 1 second how a year on where we stand. I think energy dependence is the most easy thing to say, and actually the best element of the report card to give. The turnaround that there is no Russian gas, no Russian coal, no Russian oil imported from a heavily dependent country as we speak here today is a pretty impressive element of Zeitenwende. One that had a high price, a socially high price, that also needed some decisive leadership and needed some commitment, and by the way, it needed Norway. So I think the elements of the energy dependence on that front, I think the grade is pretty good. On the defense piece, the picture is rather mixed. And mixed it doesn't mean that it's bad. It has positive and negative elements. Immediately after the speech, maybe 10 days later, not 10 months later, not 10 weeks later, but 10 days later, was an announcement about buying F-35s and thereby about nuclear sharing. This had been a debate for years in the German system. Even in this last coalition agreement, this governing coalition, several elements of it at least doubted the nature and the utility of nuclear sharing. I think that debate is over, and from that moment onwards, I think every person in Germany has heard nuclear saber rattling from Mr. Putin loud and clear. The government responded to that. I think that was a quick nuclear signal to Putin himself 10 days after this speech. I also thought the quick decisions thereafter on drones, on air defense, on the spending plan, this was all quick and relatively decisive. But then somehow, I think, and now they lost track. We're not a year on, we're seeing no increased budget, but rather only the special allotment. We're seeing hardly any procurement on the 100 billion. We're seeing no procurement reform industrial relations, ammunition orders, all of that hasn't really happened. And the mindset didn't seem to be there in order for that to actually decisively put into action. Consequence, of course, has been, as many will have followed, the resignation of a secretary, of the defense secretary. And so what we're seeing is, some people call it a lost year, I would call it a lost half year, but lost time is in a moment like this not the least important currency. So having lost time is my biggest critique here on the defense front. Now, Russia relations is probably the least defined, even in the original speech element of what Zeitenwende was supposed to be about. And here, no clear picture emerges. I will have to remind us all of the fact that when this speech was held 3 days after the invasion, I think many people, including the speaker of the speech, believed that Kiev would fall within a week. And therefore, we all remember Joe Biden saying and Olaf Scholz saying, we will defend every inch of NATO territory. That's what Zeitenwende was about. It was about the assumption of defending NATO. And it also seemed to me that there was initially some sort of, how shall I say, desire for a return to a status quo ante with Russia when they found their ways, they've corrected their ways. I think that has over the last years disappeared from public discourse. But that doesn't mean that people are fond of or thinking about some version of a Cold War, but rather some settlement that will turn into some modus vivendi under the headline that Russia won't go away. But none of that is part of a strategic direction that we can see coming from this government. Maybe it's because we can say it's too early because we don't know what the outcome of the war is, but I don't see a deepening debate about what the future relationship with Russia is to be. So a big question is that people have, and I heard you were discussing this morning, why is there a German reluctance and what are the conceptual shortcomings of all of this? Well, my first one you just heard, no Russia debate, the outcome of what Russia relations could look like tomorrow. I don't think there is a deep understanding that the German business model in this global situation is under threat, that the globalization theorem of interdependence, of peace and trade with interdependence is under threat. I don't think we have a good enough understanding of what that means for our China relationships. So I think anything that goes beyond the speech is completely open territory. The Zeitenwende is a limited concept that reality has also passing by, and it seems to me that we're in this situation that Germany has been in the last decades, I would say, where Germans want to sort of make progress on their perception of what reality is, and reality is always faster, so that this gap widens. And that's my problem with Zeitenwende. A limited concept, but reality has moved on, and the gap widens rather than closes, even with Zeitenwende. I'll stop here. Lots to say about this, maybe in the conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that clarification. We will come back to that in the discussion. Then I will give the floor to Sten Rynning, and you will speak about NATO's new strategic concept, a sufficient response. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Kate, and thank you to the Atlantic Treaty Council for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a magnificent conference. NATO strategic concept, is it sufficient? That sort of reminds me of the 1980s, when the US had Ronald Reagan, Bob Hope, Johnny Cash, and Europe had no hope and no cash. Here we go again. I'll have a few good things to say about the strategic concept, but also some points of concern, I think. One is that the strategic concept is it's actually a beautiful document. It is coherent, and it is also what it claims to be, strategic. It works from values through threats to these values to a collective defense engagement. The values are clear in the opening of the document. It's about autocracies in action and how they threaten NATO values and the democratic way of life. Then it moves to threats, and there are two threats and a challenge. That's the menu. Number one threat is Russia, labeled the most significant and direct threat to the alliance. Those are pretty harsh words. And it continues that Russia aims for spheres of influence. It engages in coercion, subversion, aggression, and annexation. Then there's threat number two, which is terrorism. It is labeled the most direct asymmetric threat, and a threat to our citizens and international peace and security. That's a different kind of threat. Clearly, it comes second. Number one is Russia. And then there's the challenge, China, with its stated ambitions and coercive policies being a challenge to NATO interests and values. Values, threats, and then comes the collective defense engagement, resolve, defense measures, resilience, nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence. That's pretty stringent, and it reads well. There's another good thing about this document, which is that it looks good also in a comparative perspective, if we consider the strategic concepts that have been made public since the end of the Cold War. If we look at those concepts, it's clear that they were pretty reactive, and they were about picking up the pieces and making NATO look good after it had been exposed to a strategic shock and had difficulty figuring out what to do. So we have the London Transformation Summit of 1990. What does NATO do now that everything is changing? The first concept that comes out in 91 is really a derivative of the London Summit. The next concept in 99 is the real one. It's the one that really tries to pick up and say, how does crisis management fit into this? Now that the new Europe has unfolded, and we promised partnership and dialogue, but then had armed crisis on our hands, what do we do? Similar with the next concept, the 2010 concept, that was really a reaction to the war on terror that began in 2001, of course. Now, NATO once again promised its transformation, like in London in 1990. It was in Prague in 2002. Strategic shock, promise of transformation. Some 8-9 years later, a strategic concept to explain why NATO is not actually in as bad a state as it could appear to be. With the war on terror, of course, it was all the politics and the division of being engaged in expeditionary warfare that was tearing at the alliance, especially the Iraq war. compared to those experiences, this actually looks like it's pretty up to date, it's up to speed, and it engages the tough issue of the day, strategic competition. It's also worth noting that those two other concepts, they were failures. Partnership and dialogue with Russia didn't turn out that well. Crisis management at a strategic distance didn't turn out so well. So at least this concept has the promise that this time we will get it right. However, there's something about this past that I detect still being present, and that is a timid engagement with what is really the core of strategic business, namely the engagement with adversaries, and the ability to derive or design political military strategy to counter the adversary. And I think in a way, depressingly, NATO is back to confront something it designed for itself in the early 1990s, but which is now coming back and it's not working. And let me just briefly explain that. The concept we have today, 2022, from last summer, may look like it's leaning in. It's being forward-looking. It's grappling with strategic competition as it unfolds. But in fact, it's as reactive as its predecessors, 1999, 2010, because the strategic shock came in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. And it took NATO 8 years to rewrite a strategic concept. Why? Because NATO couldn't agree on what Russia was. Was it a storm or was it climate change? Was it a speed bump or was it a fork in the road? NATO couldn't make up its mind. It couldn't make up its mind on what to do with Afghanistan until it got kicked out. And all of this unfolded as the politics of national resentment took hold in our nations. And we became distrustful of one another. We started blaming each other rather than building each other up. And we know the drill. This is the Trump presidency. This is Macron saying that NATO is brain dead. And it generated a lot of anxiety in NATO. Maybe we are not being timely. Maybe we're not being right. And maybe we're at each other's throat. NATO needs to be relevant. It needs to get back on its feet. And when we read this strategic concept, reactive as it is, pulling together the pieces as the preceding concepts did, I'm struck by how this brings us back to the 1990s. Because dealing with Russia, terrorism, and China, there's an axis here that needs to be in operation for this to work. And it has to do with Germany, France, Britain, and the US, and how they order their relationship. And in 1990, Germany gained unification. It thus also gained the responsibility to be in the lead on allied affairs when it came to Central and Eastern Europe. That was the deal. You become bigger, you take part of the responsibility for the neighborhood. Germany has delivered on half of that. We just heard it from Thomas. Well, half of it is the institutional enlargement and the engagement on all kinds of issues, economic, political, cultural, but not defense. And that is now needed. But Germany is not delivering. The French part of the bargain was they get leadership via European Union, by a building of something strong in Europe. But they haven't delivered through that either. Britain, of course, has exited from that solution. Meanwhile, Turkey is playing terrorism threat against Russia threat and holding Russia hostage by blocking Finland and Sweden. And the US is, I think, not clear on Europe's role in addressing what they consider the long-term challenge, namely China. And it reminds me of what I recently read a comment from a French diplomat. The US used to represent protection from risk. Now you represent protection and risk. That was in 1981. And there's this sense again in the Atlantic Alliance that the deal we made in the early 90s is not working. And the way I read the strategic concept is it tells the story why it's not working. Because Europe needs to define leadership for the European neighborhood, and the US should support that and help Europe think about its role in the world. And that is not really working, and I think we see it not being in operation. So I think the concept, the way I read it is, it's a concept for an age of anxiety. And it tells us that, yes, we do need the concept to calm diplomatic relations, to help NATO move forward one step at a time. But it's also amplifying something that is incomplete, namely the geopolitical partnership that was defined in the early 90s. So I would say that, for sure, the strategic concept is a small step for mankind. It's a potential leap for NATO, but not yet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sten, for that rather stark diagnosis. And then I invite Charlie Salonius-Pasternak to take the floor, and you will speak about NATO's new allies.
Right. Thank you for the opportunity to come here. As many have noted, a beautiful place, Munch paintings, and I think this picture back here actually explains Munch's maybe internationally most famous painting. It is a Finn seeing the sun after a long, dark winter. Unless that's a wrong analysis and that's actually a nuclear explosion, but even in that case, it's symbolically appropriate, as it's one of the things, cultural shifts, that Finland and Sweden will have to undergo from a fundamentally we alone, maybe with others, to we together with nuclear allies. And that, I think, is ultimately the biggest change. It's also nice to be here because I've spent the last year explaining Finnish defense policy and defense to hundreds of journalists, so thinking about kind of broader things like defense of liberal democracy is a nice change, so thank you for that. Now, we've heard enough about democracy, freedom, liberty. They're, of course, explicitly and implicitly enshrined already in NATO's founding. So neither Finland nor Sweden is bringing anything really new in that way. But at the end, I hope to point out that with these kind of freedoms and rights, maybe there are some responsibilities too. I started thinking about this and thinking, well, Finland and Sweden, in almost every index of democracy, whether or not it's the Democratic Perception Index, Democracy Index, the Fund for Peace's Fragile State Index, Finland and Sweden come out very similarly, strong liberal democracies. And globally speaking, of course, all of the Nordics, while we think we have some differences, really group tightly together. Now, despite this, Finland and Sweden, as we've heard, fulfill all the requirements, but we find ourselves in this odd predicament of having to defend parts of liberal democracy, freedom of speech, among other things, to at least one existing NATO member. Now, fortunately, as we've also heard, NATO as an organization and most member states seem to be quite frustrated by this turn of events. But it does highlight the spectrum of democracy that is represented even within NATO. Now, once Finland and Sweden become members, although I did appreciate Deputy Secretary General's perhaps slip that there are already 32 allies to be defended. But one concern has been that the military geographic balance will shift northward. Yes, that's true, but I think the root causes are much earlier. One, a desire to disengage from distant democracy-building Afghanistan, and Russia's actions, particularly after 2014. So Finland and Sweden are joining because of Russia, but we'll, of course, continue looking at, in NATO parlance, at 360 degrees. So maybe it's not the geographic shift which is actually a concern, but some idea that we'll, together with our Baltic brethren, build a Nordic bastion or something. I'm also not concerned about that. You heard the Finnish defense minister's comments on this, and I've literally not heard one Nordic defense official say this would be a good idea. Then implementing NATO in a regional cooperative framework, that's a different thing, but it's not a Nordic bastion leaving others out. Now, the second thing is Finnish and Swedish NATO membership will change what I call the democracy balance within NATO. There will simply be more liberal democracies in NATO. Obviously, Finland and Sweden are bringing this idea. Washington Treaty, strategic concept, and the speeches today, again, have talked a lot about democracy. However, I do think it'll have a really tiny impact in how NATO communicates, and the Deputy Secretary General noted this, with others. He mentioned the Global South, but I said global cooperative security agenda. And perhaps most importantly, I think the two countries will show that it's possible to build robust militaries, effective intelligence agencies' capabilities, increase societal resilience, and address hybrid interference, or whatever phrase you'd like to use, while not breaking the societal contracts and expectations in global democracy. That you can build a liberal democracy, maybe a welfare state, as well as the tools to defend it, that they're not opposites. So, geographic and style of democracy needles will move with Finnish and Swedish accession. But I also think Finland and Sweden will improve the alliance's collective ability to deter and defend. We've heard about geography earlier, so I won't talk about that. Here I might as well acknowledge, though, that Sweden probably presents fewer geographic challenges than Finland and Sweden, which does have a few pluses and minuses, that pesky border and things like that. Will contribute significant military capabilities on the hard military side, but also total defense. And then, more generally, per research, democracies are actually better at war. Democracies over the past few centuries actually are better at winning wars. So, the more democracies in NATO, the better NATO will be at deterrence, defense, and war, I think. Now, NATO membership will also make it easier for Finland and Sweden to defend democracy or support those that are defending democracy or themselves. In this case, for instance, Ukraine, where Finland is having to consider, yes, we've been promised that people will come to our aid, but how much of our defense capability can we give away right now? And some of those concerns will be lessened the moment we are a full NATO member. Now, finally, I mentioned Ukraine, and I want to get back to a reflection on defending democracy. Ukraine has, in Winston Churchill's words about 8 decades ago, aimed at Finns, reminded Europeans collectively of what free men and women can do. Then as now, men, women of all stripes fought. They fought for each other in the foxholes proverbially, but also, I think, for something more broader, which we've heard about. Liberty, freedom to themselves choose how society would be structured. Liberal democracy requires liberty of the state and the individual. Again, freedom. Yet a limitation on that personal freedom in the form of service to country, national service you might call it, is for small countries often necessary to ensure national liberty, even for larger ones like Ukraine. So The rights provided by liberal democracy have to be balanced by responsibilities required to defend it. And I hope Finland and Sweden can add to the examples in NATO, such as Norway, that liberal democracy is not only compatible with mandatory national service, but actually makes national defense and collective defense even stronger and more legitimate. And in this panel, we've been talking about more global aspects, and I think in the regional and global defense of a liberal democracy, perhaps it's time for more allied countries to not only give rights to their citizens, but to also demand some personal service to that cause. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlie. And then finally, our last speaker, Dr. Ben Schreer, who will talk about Asia, Pacific partners and strategy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm an Australian-German citizen by now, so I have to exercise restraints at two levels in my introductory remarks. On the Australian side, I have to restrain of getting in an argument with Camille on AUKUS, because we could be sitting here forever. On the German side, I have to restrain myself from commenting on the Zeitenwende, even though I think Thomas made some really excellent point, but I think we can get into this into the Q&A. I want to provide you with a perspective from the Indo-Pacific. So it's not the Indo-Pacific view or an Asian view, it's the perspective from someone who has now lived for over 11 years in Australia, and I'm sure there's a lot of other people in the Indo-Pacific who have a very different view than I have on this question of NATO and its global partners in the Indo-Pacific and how to engage and how to tackle that question that is China. So let me make 3 points. First point is that, and you will be well aware of this, traditional Indo-Pacific partners have supported NATO in Ukraine, either directly or indirectly. So we have Japan, Kishida-san giving a speech at Shangri-La Dialogue last June in Singapore, where he said, quote, what happens in Europe today can be Asia's future tomorrow, and we have to stand together. Japan has delivered drones, it has delivered battle equipment to Ukraine, it has supported sanctions against Russia, it is now an ITTP partner of NATO and will open a presence in Brussels. So clearly Japan has continued its support and is quite forward-leaning. Australia, not far behind, I think when it comes to lethal aid, clearly even ahead of any of the other three Indo-Pacific strategic partners providing lethal aid directly to Ukraine, supporting training, logistics, intelligence, and the like. And of course, Australia was also supportive of sanctions against Russia. The ROK was a bit more timid in terms of providing firm diplomatic support, but now has delivered munitions indirectly, not directly to Ukraine, but to the United States and to Poland, quite significant, has delivered and will deliver tanks and artillery to Poland, which in turn then frees Poland with assets to deliver to Ukraine. New Zealand, the fourth of those, has provided financial aid to the NATO Trust Fund for Ukraine, has provided money for weapons and ammunition procurement through the United Kingdom, and has provided funds for commercial satellite imagery to be made available to the Ukraine. We should note, however, that, for instance, already when it comes to China, those 4 countries do not share the same view. So while Japan and Australia clearly would see also closer engagement with NATO and Western democracies for the sake of limiting or restraining China, the ROK is much more cautious. And New Zealand is the one who is even more cautious. New Zealand does not want to see, as New Zealand calls it, that battle between China and the United States. So these 4 democracies that we're talking about here do not necessarily share the same view when it comes to China, and that has an impact on also how to see NATO. Why are these 4 different countries supporting NATO's support for Ukraine? Obviously, also for the hard-headed reason that there is some hope that if there ever was a major war in Asia, NATO countries would also come to its support. But the second argument, and the second reason, which I think we sometimes tend to overlook here with our Eurocentric perspective, is that for them, particularly for Japan, Australia, but also the ROK, the number one reason why you support Ukraine or NATO in Ukraine is because of the US alliance. You want to show the United States that you are a good, reliable ally to shore up US support in the Indo-Pacific and not in Europe. My second point, and this probably will get me disinvited from any of such conferences in the future, is that I fundamentally believe that the dichotomy between democracies and autocracies is deeply flawed when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. And it actually reveals some serious shortfalls in Europe's strategic mindset. And let me explain what I mean. As we already heard this morning from the Prime Minister, only in passing, of course, because that was not the main focus of his speech, there were some key Indo-Pacific countries that did not support the Western line on Ukraine. India, Malaysia, Indonesia, to name just 3 really important Indo-Pacific players. My key point here is this. To operate effectively in the Indo-Pacific, you need to work with non-like-minded countries. You need to work with semi-authoritarian and sometimes even authoritarian regimes to organize effective policies against the number one challenge that concerns the Indo-Pacific region, which is China. Australia is of no illusion about that. India is neither, and neither is Japan or the ROK, and the United States isn't either. The United States has a lot of programs with countries that are not democratic. Now, we've heard from the Secretary General, not today, but for instance, when he went to Japan and South Korea just recently, to say our security is interconnected. And we heard this several times, one theater today. But let me pose a question to you, or to us. Would Europe, would NATO really come to the defense of Indo-Pacific partners? Would we fight over Taiwan? Would we fight for Japan? Would we fight in the South China Sea? Maybe, but what I heard so far when walking around and traveling in some European capitals and also in Berlin is a lot of time the same thing. Oh, it's too far. Oh, we don't have enough capability. Everything goes to Ukraine at the moment. NATO has no role to play in the Indo-Pacific. China is too important for us economically. China is not Russia. China is an entirely different beast, but it's also not as dangerous as Russia. That is the argument that I've been hearing, and that's also the arguments that Indo-Pacific powers are hearing. And I'm reminded of the Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar, who just last year, actually, when the whole Ukraine war and the war against Ukraine started, I think he framed it quite nicely. He said, the mindset in Europe needs to change that, quote, Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not its problems. And I think if we really want to engage in the Indo-Pacific and with Indo-Pacific partners, democratic and non-democratic, we need to change our Eurocentric perspective. And the other problem with that dichotomy between democracy and autocracy is that from an Asian perspective, it can sound quite hollow sometimes preaching about democracy. Because, for instance, and we've discussed this today, what happens if Ukraine loses the war? And we have to look ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves, have we really done all we can to support it? That will have huge repercussions of how the Indo-Pacific is thinking about us. Last point, some cautious policy recommendations. Moving forward, I think when we're talking about the Indo-Pacific, when we're talking about how to work more closely with Indo-Pacific partners and make more use of NATO and the European Union and the like, we should drop that rhetoric about democracy versus autocracy. Because it is not, to speak in David Attenborough's term, a winning design. We also need to understand that in the Indo-Pacific, it is fundamentally about hard currency. It is about rocking up. It is about capabilities. And yet, yes, it is nice to have a German frigate sail on its own through the Indo-Pacific. But it's not enough. It is not enough, and the region can count ships, and the region can count aircraft, and it does. And so that shapes perceptions in the region of how serious Europeans are. Last point, and then I stop. Last recommendations, I think, if I were to add to the NATO pile, which is already huge, I would say, yes, you need to develop relationships further with Japan, Australia, the ROK, and maybe New Zealand. But you also need to invest much more substantially into other really important partnerships in this region. India is one, Singapore, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Indonesia. But for that to happen, at the end of the day, we also need to have that unified China strategy. And we don't have that yet. Recently I was asked, and then I stopped, about someone about the German-China strategy. And this was a senior diplomat from the Indo-Pacific region, and I banged on about the 80 pages that apparently now are being negotiated. And this person said to me, oh, no. The German-China strategy is quite clear. It was the chancellor going to China. That was the German-China strategy, and that's what we saw. So I stop here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Now I would invite you to take a seat, and then I would invite the other speakers to come join me on stage. Okay, please. You can sit. Yes, do take a seat in the middle. Thank you very much to everybody for for laying out some very stark challenges that the Alliance is currently facing. Now, the previous session was about our adversaries, laying out who they are, where they're heading. Now this session looks at ourselves. Who are we in this new age? And the Vice General Secretary this morning started, we are now in a fight for our values for the first time in many decades. Now, what values are we in a fight to secure, and what tools are at our disposal? Now, standing up to aggression against Ukraine is easy enough. Now, when we zoom out and look at liberal democracy, the picture becomes more complex and more demanding, and we are facing a partnership and alliance where we are many different countries with different types of culture and approaches to that. So I would first like all of you to reflect on this daunting challenge. Authoritarianism is quite easy to define. And in the last session, Sarah Kirchberger talked about China and Russia as like-minded countries. Keir Giles talked about Europe in denial, passivity at home, Andrew Mitra, self-deception, and let me add, complacency. Now, who are we in this new era of competition? And is the war and aggressive posture of Russia and Ukraine a crisis that we must not go to waste in terms of defining or even redefining what our liberal democracies are and what we are willing to do to uphold them. So I would like to ask each one of you, do you believe that we have an appropriate conception of the threat that the current situation is posing to our liberal democracies? Now, listening to your intervention, I have certainly drawn a conclusion in one direction, but I would like to start with Sarah. What is your impression about Helen, about the threat perception of how our liberal democracies are actually under threat?
You know, for me, the big question is, who are we? And that really will define a lot of other stuff, because our history, our culture, our previous perception and mistakes will influence it. And here I will return to one of the phrases that my colleague just said, that Australia helps Ukraine because they would like to show that they are a good ally to US. But if you follow the statements of the Australian and New Zealand politicians within the last 2 months, and the last article was just 2 days ago, they explicitly say absolutely different, that they are, because they understand what does mean the necessity to protect democracy and the values for which we stand, that we share. And as the small nation, they understand what does mean if the attack of the big authoritarian state can mean for them. And that is important, because it seems to me that these were clearly demonstrating that we're dividing anymore, not from the perception of Huntington for his civilization, or geography, or even colonial or post-colonial, because for Ukraine that is anti-colonial war. It is post-colonial war against Russia. But the United Kingdom, who are one of the biggest empires, is absolutely okay with us. So it's not about that past. It is about exactly how we define who are we, who are with us, and that is those who are shared those values that we became very much relaxed. You're not thinking about elections as something as values. You're not thinking about freedom of speech, freedom of media, freedom of religion as something extra or as the advantage that you have. For you, it is normal. It is like water or heating in your house. And these were demonstrated that no, that is not done. It is not was given. That is something to defend. And to defend sometimes not only from the military aggression, but also if you go to the countries like Hungary, you understand that sometimes you need to defend it inside, or the 6th January events in the US, even there you need to defend these values, these principles that we are. And here we can be very different, Protestant, Orthodox, Muslim, Catholic, doesn't matter. The question is that we share certain basics. And here that is interesting. For me, that is just the basic universal human rights. What Russians usually emphasize, it is the Western values, Western human rights, and our traditional values. And I always love, what does mean traditional values? Why human rights is not traditional values for you? And when you start asking then, a lot of nice research on this, very often those who support traditional values, they are supporting imperialistic, they are supporting anti-gender, anti-LGBT, and all other things that, again, for us became very obvious. So that's why, if you said, do we have a joint perception? It seems to me, yes, those who came for supporting Ukraine, they do have this joint perception because they understand why they support Ukraine as a democracy that is fighting the Russian totalitarianism.
Does this also go for the Nordic countries? Do we have an appropriate conception of what the threat is to our liberal democracies in the current situation? To Sten?
Well, rather than starting with the Nordic region, let me start with NATO. And I think there's, it has become boilerplate to talk about values. Everyone talks about values, and it's just a mechanism for generating good atmospherics. Of course you fight for values, you always do. But as a strategic guidance, you don't want to just do values. Because it will be a never-ending engagement. And so you see this debate within the headquarters, and you see it also in the strategic concept. should we be guided by values as we do our strategic planning? And NATO cannot make up its mind. Some countries would like to emphasize it. Others feel that this will become too vast. We cannot fight every authoritarian regime on earth. And we need to be smarter. And I'm on the smarter side. At least I support that some people are smart. And I try to imitate that. I think that smart democracies, they also think geopolitics. And I think we've been through an age, the age of globalization, where we thought that values would follow. And we forgot that the way you organize politics also has to do with geography and politics. And NATO needs to get back at that. And I hear, that's also what I hear Ben say in his talk. What is it about China? Well, it's the geography of Asia. And you got to figure out how you engage that. And it's the same in Europe. How do you engage Russia? Again, Ukraine is the key to the geographic engagement with Russia. But the alliance is not there, and I would encourage you to read the opening 2 sections of the strategic concept, and you see it's both values and then it's some fluidity, and the fluidity or the surprise and the unpredictability of the environment is by those countries, and I dare say Britain is one of them, that would prefer not to be tied up on some hardcore value agenda. And I think the US is trying to have it both ways. And so we're not making up our minds, and I don't think the Nordic region in any way is going to solve this. But I would like the Nordic region for once to keep both of their feet on the ground and say we need to think about this in geographical and political terms.
Now, does that mean, because when the 2 Nordic neighbors are entering NATO, as several of you were touching upon in your interventions, there will be a strengthened Nordic flank in NATO. Now, that is also the most democratic corner of Europe, according to international statistics. Now, we will have a common border with Russia, which is heading in the wrong direction. So the border between liberal democracies and autocracies sliding into a darker totalitarian state is actually our border. Will that influence anything in terms of how we view our own liberal democracies in the Nordic countries?
Well, very briefly, if I may, I think in the Nordic region, the Nordic countries, we have, in general, and certainly for my own country, we have forgotten the distinction between mobilizing your electorate behind defense spending is not the same as defining strategy. But we take this very uplifting value engagement that we use for engaging the public and mobilizing resources, setting society's priorities, and we take that same value focus and we put it into strategy. And because there's no sense of how to do strategy in the Nordic region. And I would caution everyone against sort of copying that. And I would hope rather that the Nordic engagement in NATO would help the Nordic countries get their feet a little bit on the ground.
Charlie, would you like to say?
I was going to say that strategy is supposed to be expressed very pithily, and at least from Finland's perspective, small state realism can be boiled down to one word used by a former Finnish president when asked, what is Finland's idea? And the one word was surviving, or survival. And that has guided some version of Finlandization. And may I just add, anyone who understands the toxic nature of it on domestic politics in Finland during the 70s and 80s would never in a million years suggest it to anyone else. And so, survival being the strategy. Now, on the other hand, even mentioning the threat is a little bit new to Finland. It has always been so obvious who you're surviving against. It was only some months ago, last year, that the Finnish military shifted from its adversary being called A2 Yellow, happened to use only Russian equipment and Russian tactics, to actually talking about Russia, because it would have been slightly inconvenient to tell our NATO allies, yes, we are here to practice deterrence against A2 Yellow. So I think Finland at least has been reasonably good on strategy, survival, and then how you do it also means you get along sometimes with your neighbor. And we heard about kind of cooperation on border things. There are some pragmatic things that need to be done. It does not mean you accept them in any way.
Now, in terms of just before we leave the specific Nordic flank, the democracies in NATO currently are very diverse. Now, when you want to promote, now we might agree that it is not a very wise approach, and that this dichotomy between autocracy and democracy is somewhat flawed and value-based, but still, it is one of our basic values. Now, when Sweden and Finland try to enter NATO, of course, they were met with this requirement that there are certain of the Scandinavian traditions in terms of defending human rights and refugee rights for a particular political group in Turkey was unacceptable to Turkey. Now, this has a strong security dimension to it, so in certain terms it's okay, but now we are in a situation where the freedom of speech exercised in Sweden is actually what is on the agenda. Now that is bringing up some controversies that is not really appropriate if democracy is what we are going to defend, because when you defend democracy, perception and image is quite important. Now how do you view this as an illustration of problems to come? Because there are very, very diverse traditions within the alliance currently. Anyone wants to jump at that?
Well, I'll just jump and say that it is, of course, also up to the Turkish authorities and President Erdogan how they take this in. I mean, they're fully aware that, one person burning one Quran, probably funded indirectly by Russia, does not represent the Swedish society, Swedish government, so they could have just ignored it and downplayed it. They chose not to. And I think that is probably one distinction that also this spectrum of democracies could make.
But probably I will jump here. Sometimes we need to understand, do we really speak about the values and principles, or we are speaking about politics? Because if you took the Turkish example, they're on the age of the elections, very heavy elections for Mr. Erdogan. And if you look at these, not from the NATO perspective, but from Turkish domestic policy perspective, if he would silence, that would be strange. He would definitely demonstrate his weaknesses, and it would just go out of the politics. So, and that is, by the way, one of the reasons why Russia used these. And one, we have evidences that some Russian money are behind the demonstrations in Sweden, because Russia very seldom are creating problems from nothing. They are taking the weaknesses. If you analyze their hybrid involvement in many countries, it's always different, but it always works with the certain weaknesses or problems that already exist in the society. Ethnic minorities is one of the favorite topics. Church is another one where they have influence. Energy, some politicians, if you can buy, very right, very left, always. And the issues like this. They knew that it can be the problem. They perfectly use it. And we will see even more. And it is really pity that just few countries within the NATO really looked what are those vulnerabilities where Russia can intervene and do. And Russia is perfectly using our democracy and values there and those principles, because when we started analyzing Russian disinformation, what struck a lot of the researchers that Russia is exactly enjoying our freedom of speech, freedom of media, and just found how to manipulate with it. And then it started the discussions when Ukraine closed the first media, for example, that had been openly sponsored by Russia. Oh, I remember those statements of Council of Europe and OSCE. You're violating the democratic principles. And for us it was the question, either we're surviving or we have that democratic principle that is violating the security, because the freedom is not enormous. Freedom has frameworks and certain fences when they start violating other things. And that is constant balance, philosophical even, between the national security or human security and certain freedoms and values. So now Russia just used the same in Sweden and Finland, and I'm expecting that they will be using it till Vilnius Summit for sure, even more and more.
Thomas, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to sort of the Sten's values versus interest. It is clear that we need the concept of values, to reassure us about ourselves, to reassure us about our kinship. But it's also clear that so the value proposition is not enough. I would wish for us to look at the Ukraine, certainly where I come from, to look at the Russia's war against Ukraine more in an interest than in a values dimension. Because if you look at the December proposal of a draft treaty that Russia presented to the United States and to NATO, you can clearly see what the goals are, and therefore, and those goals pertain to us in the center of Europe as much as they do to Ukraine in the first step. Therefore, if you frame it that way, then support for Ukraine is not an act of solidarity. It's not an act of democratic kinship. It's an act of interest, because in the very end, in the third element of what those draft treaties had in mind, and thankfully the Russians are open enough to tell us, they would like to replace the American nuclear umbrella with the Russian nuclear umbrella. And by the way, golly, that pertains to us in Germany as well as to any place in the rest of Europe, and certainly any place east of the Rhine. So if you restrict yourself to a values-only narrative, I think you miss the nature of what we're looking at. I think Ben made an important point here with regard to the Indo-Pacific theater, but I'd like to sort of throw that ball back to you, Ben, because when you take it the other way around, say this is an interest, we've got to work with non-democracy, you quoted Mr. Jaishankar, that also has limits. And it has limits in that our own conception of what is happening in the Asian theater tends to be about great power conflict between, if it's not about autocracy versus democracy, then to us it becomes about China and the United States, of which we are not a part of. So there is a danger of using the interest narrative into sort of in a neutralist version of it. So I'd like to pose that challenge to you, how if you don't define it as if you don't like a values component, where do you go with this in the Indo-Pacific?
I wouldn't go so far to say that I don't like the values component at all, and obviously...
I didn't mean to, didn't mean to suggest that.
No, but I know what you mean. I think it's a good question. If you are a democracy in the Indo-Pacific, such as Australia, clearly it helps if you're working with like-minded countries that are democratic, and it helps you, justify what you're doing at home and all these kind of things. But at the same time, you simply have to recognize that in order to get what you want, and what you want is you want to help put some limitations on Chinese behavior. That is what the Australians want. You need to sometimes work with countries who are not democratic at all, and where pontifications, so to speak, about global norms and values do not get you anywhere. The moment you talk about rules of the road, and the maritime law of the sea, etc., that's when you get an in. But as an explanation on Australia's position to Ukraine, there has not been a discussion in Australia of whether what Russia is doing against Ukraine is threatening Australian democracy. It is not. China is threatening Australian democracy, and we have responded quite significantly, and we can talk about that. The argument has rather been that from a geopolitical perspective, it makes sense to support the Ukraine, also to support the United States. But of course, it's also couched in the values frame. But that is not the primary driver behind the decision. Because if you do that in the Indo-Pacific, you're running into trouble very quickly. And we saw that in Afghanistan, where for years and years and years we framed the intervention in Afghanistan in a values context and not in a geopolitical context. And guess what? We ran out of steam and we lost the political debate and we had to get out. So my point is it's not worth defending the Ukraine because of human rights and civil liberties. I totally subscribe to this. I'm just saying that when you're sitting there in the Indo-Pacific, it just looks differently.
Now, turning back to the Zeitenwende, I would want to go back to this. Now, you said that it was a moment in time, but time has moved on, and the mindset is not there, if I understood you correctly. So what can be done to change the mindset? Will it change?
Well, first of all, I'd invite others to get onto this great subject as well. There's others here. No, I didn't mean to say that the mindset. In fact, our policy hasn't moved on from that. There's a constant attempt at leveling with reality. And I think I need to go back explaining Germany for just 1 second. In 1990 was a moment where Germany, from a revisionist country, even with peaceful means, unification was a revision, turned into probably the ultimate status quo power that there is. There could be no better environment than the existing one for any German government. That changed with the change of perspective that at least 2008 and 2014 meant for Europe with Russia's interventions. And I think Germany is still reveling in that first period since industrialization, which it was at peace with its neighbors, affluent, had a security framework. So I don't blame my countrymen for clinging to that framework. What I do blame politicians for, and actually our policy elites, is not having been forceful enough about the change of perspective that is needed. And what we're seeing now is population very well understanding what is going on, while the politicians being afraid of voters in a way that I believe they don't need to be of. I think populations understand much better what is going on, and they understand what Mr. Putin is doing right now. And so there, in my book, there is space. There's policy space that our politician could be embarking on without being pushed back by their electorate. So I would say that catch-up game has two dimensions. One is the catch-up game with where actually the voter is, and with policy on the other side.
If I may jump quickly, because 2 times it was said about the population, how they understand and support, and that's really true. In Germany was a wonderful example when the war started. The war started in 2014. The current aggression started. That we saw at the sociological survey the support of the German population. We saw how it influenced politicians and how they, members of Bundestag, how they started to press the government, and the government was the last one to make decisions, despite the quite a big support that was surprise for us, because only government had these false accusations about the old debt of Germany towards Soviet Union or to Russia after the Second World War, when the population was thinking in the absolutely different meanings of these. And the same is about explaining of spending more time for the military, for example. The question is that how you explain it, and that is the task of politicians. We just finished the big work about the feminist approach to the foreign policy and is Ukraine ready? Why we decided to analyze? Because currently more and more European countries announce it as the official and how it can influence aid for Ukraine. So for those of you who are very far from feminist approaches, they have one, like human rights is very important for them. It is top of the top. But the second, they are for the disarmament and for the demilitarization and all their stuff. They have all concepts. And then we ask the question in our paper, okay, So how we can put these two together? You're for the disarmament, wonderful, why not? We've been there, we rejected our nuclear arsenal, but what if we can protect our democracy only with weapons? We tried for 9 years to defend our democracy in other way. We tried it even more than 9 years, let's say since 2004, or I would say even for 300 years. It didn't help. Now we are attacked by the weapons. How we should defend ourselves? Sitting in the nice dresses and smiling and saying, no, we need to negotiate with the Russian Federation. We negotiated with them in Belarus and in Istanbul in March. Did it help? Not. So the weapons appeared the only one. So the question is that sometimes it seems to me that we artificially put things of what it is. It is not democracy and values against interest. Democracy and values should be our interests. And in this case, it is not weapons because it is some crazy militarized boys who would like more money for the tanks, but because, unfortunately, our democracy is attacked with tanks, and we didn't invent some super laser from the movies to work with them. No, we invented a few nice drones that work perfectly with the DDoS and with the anti-tank bombs, but still, yeah, you need tank against the tank. So sometimes we are just artificially put it, and it seems to me that if we would like both political and society support, we just, as experts, as politicians, to frame questions different, and it will be much easier for the population to understand what we are doing.
Ben, do you have any views on the Zeitenwende?
I mean, there's not much. I mean, I too much to add to that. For me, listening to the German debate, and I totally agree with Thomas's description about there's a lot of space, because I don't see both of those criteria being met at the moment. I do not see a Germany that has really embraced geopolitics. What I hear is things like, oh, we have to now reassure our Eastern allies that we really defend them. What I don't hear is if Russia defeats the Ukraine, we have a geopolitical problem, an order of magnitude that is Belarus today. And what I also don't hear is, oh, we really have an obligation to defend the Ukraine because of democracy and human rights. Rather, what I heard, what I hear often in the German debate is, oh, you know, there's also corruption in the Ukraine. And oh no, of course they can't be EU member anytime soon. So to me, both those ingredients, values and the geopolitics and hard-headed strategic interests, have not yet sunk in, at least not in the way that I would like to see it, and maybe Thomas as well. I don't know.
But can I ask one question to everyone? Because there is this reluctancy on the part of the Europeans to see this in a broader geopolitical context, or is it just an unwillingness to accept what choices this is bringing us, and why is Europe seemingly quite reluctant to do that? Is it because European politicians think that if we go down that road, there will be no turning back? Or is it because we might end up with a victory and we can continue perhaps more or less as we did up until this point? Is this the explanation? Because the experts' analysis is different, and I do think that Thomas has a very good point that the public understands quite a lot about what is going on, so the room for maneuver and action is probably there. Why are we still in this situation?
I mean, the most simple, the desire to return to some construct similar to the Cold War, that is not everybody's favorite option I can relate to. And that explains quite a bit of the options. The choices before us are relatively stark. So the reluctance to move into that direction is, to me, quite understandable. Now, from everything I see in reality, we're being pushed into a direction that we do not want to take. We understand European history, and when you're at the center of Europe in Germany, I think with German history in our back, the desire to move to a more confrontative setup that's a stark choice. So I would be more reluctant than some to blame our politicians for their being slow. The idea to have a cooperative framework, the idea to be able to go back to some status quo ante, I understand that desire. I don't share it, but I understand where it's coming from.
Yes.
And I think we should keep in mind when we talk about these issues that we have spent the better part of a decade being exhausted from war in the Middle East and in Afghanistan, and from a level of public disillusionment with what globalization brought. And that has fed this age of national resentment that I talked about, and of which Trump was one phenomenon. And it's really a lot to ask when you go through a decade like this, that leadership should somehow re-envision cooperation and succeed. So in a way, we're at a starting point where we have an opportunity to reimagine what we can do together. Now, then we'll see what happens. But of course, everyone carries their national history with them, and because we didn't really touch on that, but I think it's very important. The French-Turkish dispute over what Europe should be and where Europe has its boundary is immensely important in this. And the intensity of the debate between Turkey and Finland and Sweden cannot be detached from this Franco-Turkish debate over values, and does Turkey share these values? And Turkey's out to say that we do, and you have a problem. And the French are there to say, you have the problem. And that is immensely important also in NATO. And the way it feeds into the strategic concept is that the two top priorities are the Northern European and the Southern European. And they're fighting about this. And the US wants the third one, the challenge to move up in rank. And we'll just see how they manage that.
Yes.
I mean, for me, the major challenge in all of this is that we might end up, with a disunited Europe. Because the fact is, there is not one unified European position on this. And it's quite clear that Germany and France, together and individually, have failed to provide a European leadership response to this that has been acceptable to most other European countries, and I cannot fault those countries for their unwillingness to go with German positions and French positions, which have been wavering back and forth, inconsistent, etc., etc. And the matter of the fact is that without the United States, we would not be where we are at this point of time. So for me, the question then is, do the Europeans once more, learn the lessons? Because, I'm old enough to remember conversations after Kosovo War. That's never going to happen again. We will have to learn the lessons. 2004, 2008, 2014, 2022. What else has to happen? I mean, that would be my question collectively to us Europeans. What has to happen before we put up a response that is a bit different from what we are seeing today?
I guess I would end on an optimistic note. I mean, I take the point on requiring US leadership, but on the other hand, had you asked most people, is Finland going to give more than a year's worth of its acquisition money of weapons to Ukraine or someone else, the answer would have been no. Maybe the one little solution, which is going to be hard for some to hear, is the leaders seem to come from small frontline states, whether or not Finland's prime minister, Kaja Kallas in Estonia, maybe the large continental European countries should for once actually listen and follow the leadership of the smaller countries, I think that might solve some of the problems. Or then just France and Germany, give us your defense money and we'll use it properly.
Okay, now I know at the end we're getting into a good argument here, because the idea that that leadership comes from Eastern Europe, or in your case from Northern Europe, and that the center of strategic gravity has shifted, and then the next element is the center of power in Europe has shifted. That's sort of the third element of this cascade of argument that we are hearing at this. I don't believe that to be true, or I don't believe that to be true to a degree. Certainly, the center of strategic attention has changed, and our focus has changed with Ukraine. And it is certainly true that Eastern European countries and frontline countries have a front row view on this, and they are actually their sense of threat and their sense is heightened. But it doesn't mean that sort of a new leadership will emerge from Eastern Europe, because the idea that you can set an agenda is one thing, but the idea that you can unify Europe around this is a much starker proposition. So the failure, as Ben put it, of France and Germany to adequately react to this, if that is the analysis, and there's some question to that as well, is you can't live without that. And the question is not whether Ms. Kallas now leads Europe. That's not the question. The question is, can you get those countries that are geographically further away to get a similar threat perception? That is a continental problem that we've had. The French have had that with their perception of the southern terrorist threat. We have it now in the same way with Ukraine. We're going to need to work through this, but it's not going to result in the shift that some are going to, that some are positioning.
Can I add the final word of realism, from pessimism to optimism? You know, with reluctance, sometimes we need to understand that it is also the question of personal decision to take responsibility or not. It was definitely comfortable sitting in Paris, Berlin, Rome, in the nice office and thinking about how to negotiate the size of eggs or something like this. Nobody is prepared for war. Military is studying war, but I doubt that coming to the first battle, they are really psychologically ready. Politicians are much less ready for this. So it was understandable that originally just few countries were really psychologically ready to this war, to this aggression, that it is real and that it will continue. So that's normal. The question is how quickly we were ready to overcome it. And how we overcame it, that is the most interesting question, because here we either had countries like Estonia and Poland who are perfectly new what is Russia, so for them it is the historical experience of not trusting and understanding why it is. Or there are countries like the United Kingdom who experienced 2018 and Salisbury attempt of the chemical attack. So for them it became personal. Or number three, those politicians who started arriving to Ukraine as soon as possible and saw everything by their own eyes. We saw how immediately many of them been changing their position. I remember how the head of the European Parliament arrived to Bucha. Previously, she was very, average European perception of what is happening with Russia. She immediately became one of the biggest supporters of Ukraine. The same happened with the Leiden. Honestly, we were afraid that she is in charge of European Commission when everything started, because we expected German politics. She was one of the first to come, and we received one of the biggest allies. So my realistic conclusion will be, don't be afraid to come to Ukraine if you really would like to understand what is happening and what you are fighting for.
Now with that, thank you very much. Now our current support, in closing, our current support to the Ukrainians is focused on fighting and winning the war and alleviating the suffering of war. But whatever the outcome of this struggle will be, there will be a day after. And when the fighting recedes, the Ukrainians will be left with a country, an infrastructure, and an economy totally devastated by the Russian war. And what can we do to support Ukraine after the war? And I've been told that there is an initiative preparing for Reconstruction plan. So I give the final word To you, Thomas.
Thank you for this. I've been given the opportunity to talk just briefly about what is not just a pet issue of mine, but is actually very relevant to the conversation that we've just been having, which is focused on security. And it is pretty clear that a future Ukraine can only exist with profound security guarantees or security assurances, whether inside or outside of NATO. That's one of the debates that we're currently having. But it can also only exist when it has a perspective for recovery. And that perspective for recovery is something that we ought to be thinking about now rather than later. And because some people are asking, why is this an issue now? Because we have much more immediate concerns to tackle on the security front. My answer to that would be, well, post-war planning in World War II started in 1943. And if this war ends on the day after, people will ask folks like us in this room and other rooms, what have you been doing in between? They will ask, where's your plan on what you want to do post-war? So I believe that there is something called a security and recovery nexus. We need to think about those in context, because only in context will they open up a pathway to a Ukrainian future. And since we've been in this room having sort of doubts about our resolve, doubts about our unity, some gray tones, let me give you something that we can walk out of this room with that is actually positive, because last week Western countries, actually led by the G7, agreed on something called a multi-agency donor platform for Ukraine, met for the first time, largely ignored by the public last week, which I think is an important step, because in the last several months, Ukraine presented its national reconstruction and recovery strategy. The Western countries were unable to respond to that. And with this point last week and a decision that the G7 took, that is actually on its way. And that, to me, has two or three important elements. First of all, this is a G7 initiative, and it means that we will have, it's a G7 initiative that aims to be a G7 plus, and it wants to bring other countries and other players into the Ukraine reconstruction and recovery theater. So we will be looking at a broadest international coalition that you can think of, and that is necessary because of the financial needs. So that's the first good news that we've received from this largely not ignored, but undervalued news from last week. So big coalition is the first element of this that is important. And the second is what the Ukrainians call the financial Rammstein. This group combines the short-term needs with the long-term. It is now a structured form of an economic and financial burden sharing, also for macro-financial support in an organized fashion over the next few months and years, as different from the first elements, from the first months of this war. So this is an important step to allow the short-term financing of Ukraine to merge into a longer-term strategy. And thirdly, and I want to end with that in a little caveat, it also allows for transatlantic burden sharing. The United States is on board with that. We've had a longer debate, especially on Capitol Hill, that says we're doing so much for Ukrainian security today. Why don't you let the Europeans do the reconstruction? I think this is a very important step to ensure that the Europeans and the Americans are on board together in both in security and in recovery. It's one little downside, and I want to end that on that little caveat. I would have wished for this to have not just sort of a coordination platform where people come together and organize themselves as they do with a steering committee. I would actually have wished for this to have stronger leadership. I would have wished to have seen Mr. or Mrs. Marshall emerge. I'm still hoping this can happen, because what we're in need of is a really a modern-day equivalent of a Marshall Plan for Ukraine.
Just a small clarification. It is not a question in or out of NATO, because the guarantees for Ukraine, because NATO membership of Ukraine is the best insurance for all your investments in our reconstruction.
Well,
At least that is how we say.
I didn't want to open that can of worms. That wasn't my intention.
Okay, thank you very much to the panel, and give them a great round of applause.
I'm sure, Hanna, that that's not the last word on Ukraine NATO membership. We will discuss it in the years to come, I'm sure. Thank you very much to a very multifaceted panel. But that was also the whole idea behind it, to see that Europe are multifaceted. A global kind of democratic group is also. So I think it was a fascinating debate. But it's been a long, long day. I see we have missed someone after lunch. I will just remind you that we will start up again tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Then we will look into the maritime domain, discuss a little bit different topics than we had today, but look at how a great power rivalry also are knocking on the Norwegian back door, particularly in the maritime domain. I would like to thank all the speakers who have been here today, the moderators and the audiences, for your questions. I think that these kind of discussions are the backbone of our democracy, an individual right to freely to argue against each other. And the Atlantic Committee is here to secure you this free platform of interaction. To those of you who are not coming tomorrow, please leave your chains with the tags. For those who are coming tomorrow, you can keep them, and we see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Have a wonderful evening in Oslo.